Well, our scripture lesson today is taken from the book of Acts, chapter 17, verses 1 through 9. After Paul and Silas had passed through Amphipolis and Apollonia, they came to Thessalonica, where there was a synagogue of the Jews. And Paul went in, as was his custom, and on 3 Sabbath days argued with them from the Scriptures, explaining and proving that it was necessary for the Messiah to suffer and to rise from the dead, and saying, "This is the Messiah, Jesus, whom I am proclaiming to you." Some of them were persuaded and joined Paul and Silas, as did a great many of the devout Greeks, and not a few of the leading women. But the Jews became jealous, and with the help of some ruffians in the marketplaces, they formed a mob and set the city in an uproar. While they were searching for Paul and Silas to bring them out to the assembly, they attacked Jason's house. When they could not find them, they dragged Jason and some believers before the city authorities, shouting, "These people who have been turning the world upside down have come here also, and Jason has entertained them as guests. They are all acting contrary to the decrees of the emperor, saying that there is another king named Jesus." The people and the city officials were disturbed when they heard this, and after they had taken bail from Jason and the others, they let them go. Well, it's always kind of interesting. It's always been an interesting phenomenon to me, the classic Sunday after Easter attendance drop-off. Okay, it has never really made sense to me because logically it should go in the other direction. Logically it should go in the other direction because the first Easter was really unexpected. It was a shock. No one was expecting it, and then things exploded after Easter because of the good news of the resurrection. But instead, what we've devolved into is that it becomes the end instead of the beginning because it's kind of anticlimactic. I mean, okay, Jesus died this year on April 19th, rose on April 21st. Next year, he's going to die on April 10th. And we're going to celebrate his rising on April 12th. We can predict this, right? We just know, and so we plan for it. And because we plan for it, it becomes like this culminating event as opposed to a launching point. I mean, if you go back to the early church, you go back to the way it was supposed to be, it was supposed to work like this. You had the people who come, and yes, Jesus is risen. And from there, they go out and spread the news, and then they multiply. If you go according to the logic of the early church, the Sunday after Easter should be bigger than Easter. Because you have all the people who learned of the resurrection, couldn't wait to tell everybody, and went out into the world and proclaimed it. So this is a story about Paul and Silas on their journeys trying to spread the news of what had happened on Easter. But they encounter a couple of issues. There are a couple layers to this story. The first issue that they encounter is simply that people weren't expecting the kind of Messiah that Jesus was. And so there's a subtlety in the text here. If you didn't notice it, there's a little thing that it says. It says that at first he was explaining and proving that it was necessary for the Messiah to suffer and to rise from the dead. So it doesn't say that he first goes to the synagogue and says, "Here's Jesus, here's the Messiah." He has to start a step backwards. He has to start first by explaining that the Messiah who was predicted in the Scriptures was one who was going to have to suffer, die, and be raised. So he had to start there, and then it says, and saying, "This is the Messiah, Jesus." So he has to do it in 2 steps. He has to go first to telling people that their conception of the Messiah was wrong. And then, after he proves to them, it says he went there for 3 Sabbaths, so he spends 3 weeks teaching in the synagogue that their understanding of the prophecies regarding the Messiah, they hadn't quite understood correctly, so they had a misconception of who the Messiah was going to be. And then after he tells them what the Messiah is supposed to be, then he's able to fill in the blank and say, "Here he is." All right? He couldn't jump right there because they weren't set up for it. But when he starts to convince people of it, the people aren't going, "Yay, wow, this is awesome." What happens is the authorities become jealous. The religious authorities become jealous because now there are converts that are heading over to the news that the Messiah had come. And so rather than see this move toward truth as being a positive development, what they see is that it threatens their way of being. It upends them. And so what do? They form a mob and set the city in an uproar. See, I love this because, what's been popular the last few years, what's really made it as a term into the common lexicon is this idea of gaslighting. Right? Everyone familiar with the term? Anyone not familiar with it? Okay. So, it comes from that Hitchcock movie, Gaslight, where they're convincing the person that their memories are faulty, okay? And so what happens is we have this story where they accuse Paul and Silas of creating all this disruption when in fact they're the ones who created the disruption, all right? They went out and they form a mob, they set the city in an uproar, and they go, it's because of them. It wasn't us, because of them, those guys. Those guys did it. And so what happens is that they are upset. They're upset because their understanding of the status quo is being challenged. And then their response to the challenge is to blame the people who were teaching the truth. They blame the people who bring the news. Now, there's a piece of this here that's a little off the beaten track as far as the sermon goes, but it's actually one of the more important life lessons that we all have to learn, especially like from the time you're a little kid. What you have to learn is that you are not responsible for how others react. Okay? It's one of the things you have to learn. So it's like the time when you're a little kid. Ever have a little kid get into a fight? And one of the things you'll often hear from the kid, he hit me first. He hit me first. He hit me first. And so they say that as if, which may be true, the fact that the person hit them forced them to hit back. All right? And the standard, mom response to this is, well, that doesn't mean you had to hit him back. Okay? You are not responsible for how others react to you. People are responsible for their own reactions. You are responsible for what you do. They are responsible for how they respond. This idea of making a person feel that what they did forced you to respond gets misused in so many situations. It's one of the more common things that you will see in situations of domestic violence, right? You will see the abusive spouse who creates an atmosphere within the relationship where the abused spouse comes to believe that the abuse is caused by something they did. I upset the abuser, so the abuser abused me. And they end up taking the blame onto themselves, all right, as opposed to sitting back and properly saying, no, the person is responsible for their reactions. Even if I said something that upset them, even if I didn't do things the way they wanted it to be done, they are responsible for their own reaction. Okay. Paul and Silas are not responsible for the fact that the authorities responded in the way they did. Paul and Silas are not responsible. They are responsible for getting the mob together and getting the city in an uproar. But what they do is they turn around and in the classic abuser-abused kind of relationship, oppressor-oppressed kind of relationship, because we see that in oppressive situations in our society as well, where people sit there and, you'll have an oppressor group say to the oppressed, well, if only they had known their place. If only they had stayed quietly oppressed, we wouldn't have to crack down on them. All right? So what happens is that in classic abuser-abused, oppressor-oppressed kind of fashion, they blame Paul and Silas for the uproar. You know why the uproar happened? Because they came here. They came here and they started teaching these things that upset the status quo. So of course, we responded the way we did. See, they are the people who have been turning the world upside down. I love that phrase. This is probably one of my favorite phrases in all of Scripture. This idea that Paul and Silas go, and they are turning the world upside down. I love it because that is exactly what faith is supposed to do. Faith is supposed to turn your world right side up. See, what faith is actually doing in us, the way faith is supposed to work, is it should show us the extent to which we had actually been living in an upside-down world. We had actually been living with inverted values. We had actually been living in a world where we didn't understand what was up. And then faith turned us right side up. But it feels like upside down until you get used to it. By the way, the inability to tell whether you are right side up or upside down is a very common phenomenon. Okay, people don't understand it. I've never flown an airplane. Okay, but my friends who are pilots who've just gone into private pilot training, they talk about how difficult it is to know that you're actually flying straight. He said there's a standard exercise that they do with pilots and, just flying a little single-engine Cessna. And what the instructor will do early on in your training is take you up, have you fly level, okay? I mean, high enough where the instructor, of course, can save you after you will inevitably make your mistake. They will have you fly level, and then they'll put a blindfold on you. And they'll say, all you have to do now is keep it level. They can't. All right. What they will do when they're going by feel is they will inevitably start to put the plane into a dive. All right. And the instructor will, of course, gently pull them out of it. And what they're learning is that you cannot trust how you feel. What you need is your instruments. They're teaching them that what you need to do is you are flying level when your instruments say you're flying level. You're not flying level when the pressure on, literally it's the pressure on your bottom as you're sitting there that you feel. And what they strive for is like this constant pressure, and that's what puts them into a dive. Okay, so that there's pressure that feels right. And so what happens is they'll say, look, no, you have to go with your instruments. All right? Our faith has to be like that instrument panel that reminds us when we're actually flying straight, that reminds us when we're actually doing what it is that God would have us do. Because living according to the ways of God is unfamiliar. Living according to the ways of God does feel like it's upside down compared to the way things used to be. And the bigger problem that we often have in life is that even when we begin to invert, even when we begin to understand how God would have us live, other people around us don't always welcome that change. And they don't always welcome that change in us. Because the people around us, the people we had relationships with, often are the people who knew us in the upside down world. Okay. So it can happen in all kinds of environments, right? You can be the leading salesperson at your firm, and there's nothing wrong with being a leading salesperson, but the day you walk in and announce to your boss that you're really not that concerned about sales, there are more important things in life, don't expect your boss to be happy. Okay? They're not going to necessarily welcome this change in perspective in your life. It's particularly acute among friends that I've had who were in recovery. Okay? Because their friends who went into recovery, who had friends who were not in recovery, didn't appreciate the fact that they were, in effect, losing a drinking buddy. And so often they didn't act in the most supportive way toward their friend who was trying to find a new way of living. Right? That's why it's always important whenever people do things, for example, everyone knows how to not do the things they shouldn't do. But it's why people join groups to do it. It's why people join a group like Weight Watchers, or why they go to AA or stuff like that, because it's not that you didn't know what you needed to change. It's that you needed to surround yourself with people who would actually support you in the change. You needed to surround yourself with people who would be supportive, because the people who were in your life in the area where in the sort of the pre-change you, are not necessarily going to be supportive of the changed you. And so the people were not supportive of the news that Paul and Silas were bringing, even if it was true. But in the wake of the resurrection, in the wake of what we know to be true, we have a calling to become that instrument panel to the world, to become those people who say, you know what, I know which way is up. I know which way it's supposed to be. I know that the ways of God, the ways of the risen Christ, are the ways that we should be following, and we're going to stick to that. And we're going to stick to that even if there are people around us who find it upsetting. We're going to stick to that even if there are people who don't support us in the change that it calls us to. So the week after Easter, the question that I would pose is pretty simple. It's, what do you now know because of the resurrection? What do you now know that helps to flip your life differently? Maybe not completely upside down, but that at least reorients you a little bit. Do you know that there is more to life than just this life? And when you know it, how does it change the way you live? Do you know that God loved you enough to send his Son to go to the cross for you? And if you know that, how does that change the way you live? How does that change the way you look at the world? How does that change the way you look at the people around you? Upside down and right side up are relative terms. Okay. Right now, we're sitting here saying the entire continent of Australia is upside down. And they would say the same to us. Right? They're relative terms that only have true meaning when you have a reference point against which you're speaking. And for us, the resurrected Christ is the reference point from which we determine what is right side up and what is upside down. And we have to allow the fact, the truth of the resurrection, to give us markers, to give us instruction, to give us understandings that we look at and point to and say, being and living in accord with those understandings is what it means to live right side up. And even if most everyone else is upside down, we still know that we're right side up. In faith, we need to be that reference point for the world. In so many ways, that is the way we best serve the world, if we can point the world to right side up living, even knowing that some of them will be upset, even knowing that some of them will try to blame us for making them upset. We have to know what's right, what's good, what's true, what's love, and show the world that often has lost its reference point for what those things are.